The scripture this morning is from the book of John, chapter 10, verses 11 through 18, page 103 in the New Testament in your pew Bible. Hear the word of the Lord. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thanks, David. He woke up just as the sun was peeking over the top of the mountains off to the east, just as he had done every morning for the past couple of months. He took a few minutes to enjoy the beauty of it all, and then he quickly got up and he made a quick look in every direction to make sure everything was safe. He made one trip around that low stone wall of the sheepfold, making sure the wall was still secure. Then he stopped at the gap that had been filled with briars the night before at what is called the gate. The sheep, they were beginning to stir as he walked around, and one by one they started to walk over to the gate to begin the day. With all the sheep accounted for after a safe night, his first task was to see that they all got a good drink of water. He had planned this last night, so he knew the direction to lead them that would be the safest to take. He knew there was really no such thing as a safe path in this country, and that's why he had his sling hung on his belt with a small leather pouch filled with stones. You see, the sling with stone was not just used to slay giants as David once did. They were also quite effective against things like mountain lions. And like all other experienced shepherds, he was a crack shot with his sling. He also carried his crook, the long stick with that curved hook on the end. It wasn't just for show, nor was it some kind of a badge to let everybody know that he was a shepherd. The stick was a perfect second line of defense against any intruder, like a wild animal or a thief determined to steal a sheep or two. A quick, firm thump on the head with that solid piece of wood would quickly convince any attacker to look elsewhere. And the hook? Well, there were many times to get his flock from one place to another that the shepherd had to lead them through a dangerous forest where the wild animals hid so well. Some of them went up and down through really steep and dangerous canyons with trails that had sharp cliffs on both sides. And once in a while, one of the sheep would miss a step and fall from the path. Now, this happened a lot on one of the trails this shepherd used, leading from the dry lands around the lower part of Jericho up to the green pasture lands near Bethlehem and Jerusalem. That trail went through a valley that was dangerous. It was filled with wild animals, thieves, and steep, narrow paths. That valley was sometimes called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And as careful as they were, sometimes the sheep would lose its footing on the dangerous path and would fall off the trail down into the ravine. And the shepherd would take his staff, and using that long pole like a fish hook, he would reach down into the crevice, reach the hook around the leg of that sheep, and then gently lift him back up to the trail. And as he led his flock toward the water, he was hoping to avoid any of those kind of nasty surprises. Now, last night, before he went to sleep, he had walked around to find the safest path to lead his flock to the water. Not only was it important to find the safest path, but he also had to be very careful to find the watering hole as well. You see, his sheep, they didn't swim well, especially now that they had these long woolly coats that were filling out so beautifully. If they fell into the water, they would soak up like a sponge, and he might not be able to pull them back to safety again, even with his sturdy hooked staff. So he had to search around for some quiet waters, a place where the currents were still, where they could safely drink with no risk of being caught and pulled away by the current. Now, he knew this land very well, including the perfect watering spot, right next to a very nice pasture where his sheep would be able to graze today. And after planning his path last night, he was ready to lead them there this morning. So while his sheep were enjoying their morning drinks, the shepherd walked around that nearby pasture. He walked around slowly, closely examining every inch of the ground. And he would stop and he would pick up sharp stones or briars that might cut their soft noses of his sheep as they were grazing. He looked for plants that might be poisonous or that might cause illness. He looked for scorpions and snakes or insect nests that might harm his flock as they innocently grazed in this place. There were enemies everywhere, and it was his responsibility to prepare their dinner table right in the middle of them. After they had had their fill of water, the sheep began to move around the pasture and sort of settle in for their normal day of doing what sheep do. And if you don't know what that is, it's eat and poop, and eat and poop some more. The shepherd found a tree nearby where he could see the entire pasture, and he settled down into the shade, keeping one eye alert for any danger to his flock. Now, one of the things that he was watching for was to make sure that none of those sheep wandered away from the flock and got lost. Sometimes, you see, a sheep might find a really great patch of food, and they would just kind of keep eating and eating and eating until suddenly they were far away from the rest of the flock. And if that single sheep got far enough away from the shepherd with his sling and staff, it became the perfect victim for enemies that might be hiding nearby. And when the shepherd found that one of his sheep was missing, his one goal was to find that lost sheep. You see, the rest of the flock were relatively safe together, so the shepherd focused on finding the one lost. Any shepherd who was worth his salt would search until that lost sheep was found. Fortunately, today he found his lost little sheep just over the hill and quickly guided it back to the safety of the flock. Once in a while, the shepherd might find a sheep that belonged to someone else, one that had wandered off from their shepherd. In that case, he would take that sheep into his own fold and care for it as if it were his own until he could find the sheep's true owner. Any lost sheep was welcomed into his fold. No sheep was left to stand alone and risk the dangers of not being included in the safety of the flock. Now, actually, none of these sheep were actually his. It was quite common that shepherds did not own the sheep on their own. Some did, but those shepherds were very rare. Most shepherds spent their time taking care of sheep that actually belonged to someone else. At the beginning of the grazing season, the shepherd would travel from place to place, collecting the sheep that were to be entrusted to him. He would then lead them off to the grazing lands where he would be responsible for them until safely returning them to their masters several weeks or months later. And they would return healthy and covered in valuable wool, and the shepherd would then receive his reward for all of his hard work. If he lost any sheep, he would have to pay for them out of his reward. Most importantly, though, the shepherd who lost sheep would soon be seen as untrustworthy and would quickly find himself without any owners who were even willing to hire him. So you see, protecting the sheep was more than just a financial issue for the shepherd. The shepherd who did not protect his flock really was not a shepherd. He might be considered a hired hand, someone who was paid to do something and who may or may not do it very well. But if he truly wanted to be a shepherd, his number one responsibility was to take care of each and every one of the sheep that was entrusted to his care, even if that meant risking his own life to protect them, even if it meant placing himself with his sling and his staff between his flock and an attacking mountain lion or a band of thieves. You see, if he didn't protect his flock, he was not a shepherd. Now, there were no highly visible great rewards for being a shepherd. The pay was fine, but it was not enough with which to actually build a comfortable home. Besides, since he was out taking care of someone else's sheep for months and months at a time, the reality was he didn't have time to take care of a home. It just wasn't feasible for most shepherds. It wasn't a job that earned high levels of respect in the community other than from the other sheep owners and shepherds. Now, most shepherds were really, really good with sheep, but not always very good with other people. And that's probably why they enjoyed spending so much time out on their own, up in the hills, away from the rest of the community. Shepherds were always there, a part of the community, but never really in one of those groups. Shepherds were merely seen as a group of people who took care of someone else's sheep. Now, as our shepherd sat under the shade tree, an interesting thing happened. Throughout the day, one by one, each of the sheep would move apart from the flock, and they would walk over to stand next to the shepherd, and he would quietly talk to them as he rubbed their chin or rubbed their belly, gave them a little scratch behind the ears. He knew what each one of them liked. And after a few minutes of attention, that sheep would then return to the flock and continue their day. But each one would come and visit the shepherd. You see, the sheep knew their shepherd's voice and could tell his voice apart from other shepherds. Even in the confusion that happened when two flocks happened to meet on the same trail, the sheep knew their shepherd's voice and could easily follow him. He was their shepherd. Now, as the sun began to fade in late afternoon, the shepherd led the flock back to the still waters again, and then back to the stone sheepfold. As the sheep lined up to enter the narrow gate, the shepherd knelt down and examined each and every one of them, making sure that as they entered, and he would make sure they were not covered with some briars, and he would call them by name. And he even rubbed some healing oil on any cut scrapes that might have gotten on their soft noses during the day. And after each sheep was safely inside the fold, the shepherd would then pile up the briars up tightly around that little gate entrance to form a very secure gate. He then walked all around the sheepfold again, securing any loose stones, and of course stacking more briars on top just to make sure that it would discourage any predators from trying to jump the wall. And only then, after seeing his flock was safe for the night, did the shepherd find his comfortable spot in that little stone tower that he had built nearby, and he would settle in for the night. Now, just as through the day, he spent the night with one eye resting. The other eye, he kept a sharp lookout for anything that might threaten his sheep. It was just what he did. And when the sun came up on this particular morning, it was different. It was the end of the grazing season, and after checking each of his sheep, he led them back to the waters and then back down the long trail toward the city. One by one, he presented each sheep to their owners until he had returned safely each and every sheep that had been entrusted to him. And he felt the weight of the pouch that he carried, now filled with the coins from the payment for his past month's work. But more than that, he felt this warmth inside, knowing he had done exactly what he had set out to do. He had taken care of each and every one of his sheep. You see, he was no hired hand. He was a shepherd. And as he was making his way back to his humble home, he noticed there was a group of people standing by the sea. They were standing and sitting all along the shore, all listening to one guy who was talking with them. And as he walked nearer, he remembered things that he had heard about this man, this teacher. You see, as a shepherd, he really didn't know much or care much for things like prophets and miracle workers. His main concern was his sheep. Now, don't misunderstand. He was a man of faith. You have to have a strong faith to stand in front of real danger holding only a sling and a stick. But his faith was not the sort that spent a lot of time talking about and debating. You either stood up to your enemies or you didn't. It was a pretty basic faith. So he was walking toward the back of the crowd, more out of curiosity than anything else. And as he moved closer in order to be able to hear better, he suddenly found himself standing in the middle of a group of people who did not seem very happy to see him. They were dressed in very stylish robes. They were covered in fine linens and jewels, and they smelled like they had been doused in expensive perfumes. And they were all looking at him with great disdain. Now, he was as clean as anybody could be who had spent the past months living in the mountains with sheep. But he had not been fortunate enough to have covered his body with expensive oils as these priests had. So in comparison, yes, perhaps he did stand out a bit from that crowd. Now, perhaps it was the look that those priests gave the shepherd, or maybe it was the hesitance he saw in the shepherd's eye that caught the speaker's attention. Whatever it was at that point that Jesus looked directly at them and said, "I am the good shepherd." And as he looked directly at that stinky shepherd, he went on to say things like, "The good shepherd lays down his life for his friends, lays down his life for his sheep." And then he would say, "And I know my sheep, and they know me, and I lay down my life for my sheep." And then his gaze switched over to those very nice smelling priests, and he said, "The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the hired hand doesn't care for his sheep." Now, every eye in the crowd was now on these two groups, the rich, powerful, perfumed priest and that fresh from the hills shepherd, just waiting to see what was going to happen next. It was clear that Jesus had struck a nerve somewhere. The earlier smiles and looks of self-satisfaction on the faces of the priests had changed to a look of raw anger, as though they were trying to figure out who they should destroy first, this little sheep herder or this rabble-rousing preacher. And before they could make up their minds, Jesus pushed things a little further. "So there will be one flock and one shepherd." Now he had the priests' full attention, but they were no longer listening to what he said. They had already made up their minds. In a matter of seconds, Jesus had just declared that the shepherd was of more value than the priest, that the shepherd was trustworthy and the priest was a hired hand. And one flock? Oh no, never. Religious law was clear that there was a distinction between those who were clean and those who were unclean. There was not one flock, and there never would be. They were the leaders of the true flock, and they had the power and the authority behind them to make sure that it continued to be that way. They looked at the shepherd, and they still saw him as harmless, meaningless, and of no real threat. No, the threat was right there in front of them. This rabble-rousing rabbi. And with the look of blood in their eyes, they glared at this preacher who now called himself the Good Shepherd. He was going to have to go. And while all of this was burning through their minds, these priests and scribes and Pharisees, the shepherd very calmly moved back through the crowd, already thinking of the work that he needed to get done that day. He had sheep to collect, to take back to the hills and to care for. You see, it was what a good shepherd does. How are you a good shepherd to those who have been entrusted to your care? Are you loving them well? We all have people who have been placed under our care. Are we loving them well? Do you depend on the great Good Shepherd? Do you know him? Can you recognize his voice in the crowd of life? And do you listen? Do you listen when he calls? And do you follow him where he leads? Amen and amen.